Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Boombostic Health here in the wild in Indianapolis, our beautiful headquarters city, where we have the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and the month of May, it's all about the Indy 500. So we've got this group that's gathered here, group of healthcare innovators to both share ideas and also experience some of the fun that Indianapolis has to offer. We have a very interesting topic today, which is focused on real world evidence and data in healthcare and how you can safely unlock value from this data. And before I introduce the guests here, I want to mention that this is such a fundamentally critical issue as we look forward at healthcare, because all too often there's a lot of confusion about and concern. Some of it can be warranted, some of it's really unwarranted about, hey, what can be done with my data, or what can be done with this data if it's shared in any way or linked in any way. And there are guidelines and regulations like HIPAA people talk about that were not designed to prevent healthcare progress. They were just designed for some basic protections around information, so it wasn't used in an untoward way. So very excited to have Julie Ferris from Spindle Health with us, and John Markl of HC1 with us, who are both veterans of this industry of how you can safely and effectively use real world evidence and data in healthcare. So thanks for being here with me.
Thank you.
So that was a very brief introduction, but give me another, minute, Julie. Why don't you start on what's your background? What lens are you coming to this through? And then shift to John, and then we'll get into the meat of this and hopefully get our group here more up to speed on what is happening and what the future looks like.
Absolutely. So Julie Ferris, founder and CEO of Spindle Health. I've actually been in the industry that's referred to the real world data industry for about 18 years now. I started adjudicating claims at Independence Blue Cross. I learned all about the medical billing and learned everything about, the billing cycle and revenue cycle management. And I found out that there was a whole nother world that existed with the secondary data component, where it leverages de-identification, which is a standard under HIPAA, where you can use direct PHI in a compliant way as long as it's not directly identifying patients. And so there has been a longstanding and thriving industry that has leveraged this technique to go ahead and be able to use the data. And it's been a really important part of research, and it's really hit the forefront recently. Because you saw the FDA start to tell companies in the industry to start using something called real world evidence, which is all using real world data. And so it preserves patient privacy. My company in particular, the Lens, what we do is we build the technology to de-identify the data and make sure that everything is compliant. And so we do a full stack solution, which includes the part where you remove the patient information, so the individual identifiers that directly identify the individuals according to HIPAA, and then even evaluate the data sets to go ahead and make sure that there's nothing even within the variables themselves that you can uniquely identify anyone. And so we build this type of technology, and one of the things that we did specifically was design it for scale, because data and everything is moving at a mile a minute, and the level of data that is out there has also scaled exponentially. And so that's the goal, is to go ahead and move it and bring it with the speed of the market.
John Markl.
Thank you. Excellent, Julie. My name is John Markl. I'm the Vice President of Data Strategy here at HC1, also a proud husband, father, coach, etc. I have over 20 years experience in healthcare data management as well as strategy. So really looking forward to this conversation. Like so many others, I have personal stories here that have really driven me to look at diagnostics and value patient safety, specifically around Alzheimer's. So that really changed my mission statement personally. And I'm very excited to be here to talk about this topic.
Cool. Glad you guys are here. So I think we should just start from the very basics. Okay. So we talk about de-identification of data and tokenization of data and monetization of data, all the Asians of data. And I think like 99% of people are just kind of like, what are you talking about? Like, how does this actually work? Who's paying for it? What is that? What does that mean to tokenize it? I know there's one of the parts you guys talk about, Julie, is like this token tax Everybody knows Datavant now, and it kind of feels like they're a standard. But is there, a better, different way or whatever? So maybe Julie, you could just lead off with when we're talking about this need or opportunity to use data to create value. What does that mean in your context in like 101? Explain it like we're all in the fourth grade level of this data world.
Happy to do so. So when you de-identify data, there's two parts of the process.
Well, let's start before that. Why do you even want to de-identify it? Like, what is, there's some end outcome you're trying to deliver. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I think the biggest outcome right now, and actually I was really happy with the question, I almost jumped out of my seat. The goal is to really bring forth a data set that has scale and removes the selection bias. And so when you have to get patient consent and you're working with an IRB board or you're working directly with patients, you are limiting the population, the pool of patients that you can go ahead and use and mine the data on. And that is a huge problem because, to your point, you've bifurcated the market potentially from a diagnostic perspective, the simple behaviors of people just being interested and proactive in their health, or also something that can contribute to it is an economic state, right? And so the goal of de-identified data is to really, bring it forth to a large scale. So when people are typically doing this type of approach to a data set, we're talking about millions of patients, 50 million, 200 million patients that are able to be analyzed and used with their healthcare data and other factors where you can glean insight. And so it has a significant impact in the market because over time, it wasn't just healthcare data that's evolved. It's really moved to consumer data and now the wearable behavioral data. And so all of these things can actually be combined together. So you actually have data with context. And that is incredibly meaningful to understand the full patient journey, which you mentioned earlier. And that's a really key part to learn about what were the signals, what was it like for a patient to go ahead and start to realize that something wasn't right and their health was compromised. What was it like to go to the doctor and like how many tests did they have to do at the PCP before they needed to a specialist and actually got the diagnosis? What were the laboratories, like what was the deciding factor? And we all know that the healthcare ecosystem isn't exactly streamlined, right? It is a very chaotic process where people get lost frequently and patients get very frustrated and providers need support. And so this type of data can really go ahead and bring scale and solutions to the market. And I think, as we move forward, especially in the age of AI, it's going to be something that we hinge a lot of structure and decisions on as we go ahead and move forward, even with value-based care.
So helpful. I appreciate that description. So I think that probably helps everybody just get grounded in why does any of this even really matter. So what I would summarize that I heard is from the perspective of creating a large scale set of data that can then be used for research and for programs to make healthcare more effective, more efficient. The de-identification model is very helpful because it doesn't require all the friction of a study that you have to implement if you're identifying patients and actually sharing their information at an identifiable level.
And the bias too. So and like one of the things that, you had, United Healthcare sitting up here earlier, United Healthcare, they're going to be mining their own data, right? They have step edits. They have specific requirements that are already in place from like their systems that they went ahead in the protocols to say, nope, you have to do this first and then do this. And so that creates a bias in the data. Whereas it could be very different if you look at Aetna. So stitching together these different types of assets in this capacity gives you the scale, and it really removes the selection bias of any given asset. And, the U.S. ecosystem from a healthcare perspective is very, very fractured. And so this is the gap that it fills.
Got it. And before we get to more of the technicalities that you were starting to talk about, maybe John, just talk a bit about where is the path to the money on this? Because again, all of these things seem to ultimately, if you follow the money, you kind of figure out what's making this all work.
So first, patient safety, patient security is paramount, right? As Julie indicated, whether we're dealing with AI, spreadsheets, no matter what, that is the first and foremost thing that we take into consideration when tokenizing and when looking for money. So there's a couple of different ways. One, we talked about it a lot earlier on some of your other episodes this morning about closing gaps in care for patients, right? That leads to certain things. As Julie indicated, larger studies, larger abilities to, for life sciences or med device companies to get their therapies adopted, right? These sort of larger aggregated data sets enable that, right? At the de-identified, highly secure level. Right. So if I have a precision therapy and I need to understand the patient population, how they may interact with certain providers, certain tests, and certain things, the identified data at the aggregate level can help me understand those things, as well as clinical trial improvement, which we've heard a lot about, which is very exciting, so that you can figure out exactly the patient population that you need to talk to so that your clinical study becomes more effective, which has those downstream effects.
And so when we say gaps in care, another one of these somewhat subject to interpretation, what you mean, it's saying this person needs a diagnostic or a therapy that wasn't otherwise being delivered.
Correct.
And so in this case, you're talking about a device or a pharma precision medicine that could be connected into that physician who has that patient. And and ultimately, so there's a positive outcome for the patient, positive impact for whoever the medtech or pharma company is, and for the physician.
Correct. And to the greater ecosystem as a whole, too, right? Because that precision engagement at that level optimizes the entire healthcare process for that provider, for that patient, for that therapy, and ultimately for us. It is another way to do that. Yeah.
So it becomes a very virtuous type of cycle.
Exactly.
So unlike the doomsday, scary thoughts about what's happening with my data, what are you doing with my data, this is about how you apply it to meaningfully advance healthcare delivery. So
Absolutely.
we got that established. So back to where you were starting to go, Julie, which is then let's say everybody in this room is somehow involved with healthcare, and we all have access to data, and we have customers that have access to data, partners that have data. And so what's step one when you say, what are the three steps when you say, okay, I would like to start using this data in this world of de-identification so that it's even ready to be driving this benefit? What do we do?
There's three steps. So the first step is going ahead and doing something called tokenization. And so that's where you're taking the individual identifiers, the 18 that's listed underneath HIPAA, and you're going ahead and encrypting that information. So you actually don't know that this, individual is Julie Ferris. It's an encrypted identifier. But you also have to balance that with ability to connect that with other data sets, because as I mentioned, interoperability is incredibly important. You want to be able to connect someone from this claims data set to an EMR data set. And so there is a way to do this. It's called privacy preserving record linkage, and that is what tokenization is called in the marketplace. And so that's a software program that runs on the side that has the direct PHI. So it never leaves your firewall. Your PHI stays on your firewall and completely secure. And in our model in particular, we actually developed an open source token model. So it's completely free. And so you also get to control the software at Spindle Health that is unique to our organization. And then after tokenization, you want to evaluate any data that's leaving your firewall. An expert under expert determination, which is the approach that's required under HIPAA, we actually evaluate the specific variables that are in a data set, and we determine the re-identification risk to say, okay, this data set has these variables, and they're not going to go ahead and uniquely identify anyone and can't be connected back. And therefore, it's safe to go ahead and send the data out the door. And by that point, once you do that evaluation and the risk is very small, that's the actual definition in HIPAA, is very small risk of identification, you will go ahead and get a formal certification to send the data out the door, and it's no longer PHI.
Right. So after that very rigorous, thoughtful, appropriately so process works, it happens, that's when we go back to what we were talking about before. Data in the aggregate is then available for those clinical studies, for those therapy adoption processes, things like that. So having gone through this many times with Julie and others, it is a very rigorous process, as it should be. I think healthcare has taken tremendous strides over the last decade, right? And we continue to make improvements in this area because this data is so useful for advancing healthcare, advancing therapies for patients, that doing it this way is the only way to do it and the correct way.
So this term tokenization is one that is a really fun word. And really what it means is that you're taking data at an identifiable level and running a process where you're assigning, it's like a serial number basically, to every single one of those records. And if you have two separate data sets and you tokenize both of them and you run it through the same tokenization engine, then you'll actually be able to connect those data sets so that you can see more about what's going on with any given individual without knowing who that individual actually is. And so I mentioned earlier, there's this big 800-pound gorilla that sort of made this concept more known, and they charge a fee for doing the tokenization and doing the comparison, and I believe, right? And so you're describing an open source model, which we're hearing a lot about open source in the AI world with DeepSeek from China, and how that's different from what OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and others are doing. And so there's this need in any healthy market to have alternatives. And it sounds like what you're describing is this open source alternative. But in order for that open source alternative to actually be helpful, it has to be adopted across multiple data sets, right? Or folks have to be willing to run their data through your tokenization or the open source tokenization in order to see if it matches, right? Am I thinking about that the correct way?
You're thinking about it the correct way. And so, the best way the goal ultimately is interoperability, right? And so we keep seeing all these limitations. And I always point out, especially in these conversations, that when COVID hit, one of the first things that they did was enact the emergency component of HIPAA that allowed them to more freely exchange information. So it is a very known thing that HIPAA, as many, positives and good things that it brings to the table, can go ahead and also kind of cause a lot of challenges when it comes to understanding the research and context. And so you saw them instantly remove that so institutions could share and exchange information a lot more freely. And it was something that really helped enable the quicker resolution to the pandemic. And so, the goal for what we're bringing forth in our solution is to maximize the network effect, because that's the thing of value, is that, we want to make sure that there's a token that is out there that anyone can use and they have their control of it, and they're completely responsible and completely HIPAA compliant. They will bring forth something where it's not specific to one vendor, because there's actually multiple tokenization vendors out in the industry. It's not just the one mega. There's quite a few that's out there, and even some legacy solutions that have been around for over 20 years. And so this was the goal really was primarily to put forth something that, was always promised but never delivered. And now it's delivered to, the market.
Well, that's super interesting. Thank you for that. So switching gears over to this money conversation, there's this world of data monetization. So you got to use the Asians. And it, in many respects, is kind of sleazy. Just putting it out there. And I've had a lot of experience with various data marketplace vendors, and oftentimes it's this race to the bottom on price, and it's being, slung by slick salespeople who really don't have any clue how the end user is actually going to derive value from that information. And it's just a race to the bottom. That's a zero-sum situation, and it's not good. It's not good. And we all kind of have to pay for those sins, because when you see that happening, then you sort of think, well, this whole situation's a mess. Our posture on delivering insights from healthcare data is to be very purpose-driven and to know that there's a solution we're part of, or we're informing, that gets to the end result of better care, lower costs, something that is worth doing, not just can we dump our data on anybody who's willing to pay anything for it.
Yeah.
And that's probably kind of a provocative thing to say in a healthcare innovation area where we're looking at being aggressive and innovative. But I think it's super important because it's a headwind that we all face. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the bright side of this healthcare data, real world evidence world looks like? And ultimately, what do you see happening to these commodity marketplace people that are a dime a dozen at this point?
I'll start.
Okay.
So I think what you're saying is very correct. And you have to be very purposeful, right, for how you partner with another organization. Do they share your same values? Or do they share your same mission, right? Are they honed in precisely on patient safety, right? Changing the game in healthcare, these types of things. I think a lot of the old list providers, if you will, or the folks that call themselves data aggregators and just did some things whenever it seemed right, they are fading, right? And I'm glad to see that, because that is not what healthcare data should be used for. That doesn't advance care. That doesn't advance the patient population getting healthier, right? So we are seeing a decrease in that, and that makes me feel personally very good. But I still think there's a challenge when you talk to different providers and different analytics organizations, that you make sure it is critical, as I said, that they share your mission and they share your values. So we continue to look through the lens of partnerships directly through that mission. So,
And there has been so much ROI directly back to the patients. And my favorite example of this is actually clinical trials. And so a lot of people lack the appreciation that we were hitting really an all-time low on clinical trial enrollment. And there were very large disease states that were getting barely any patients enrolled in their trial, and the compromised results. What this has enabled has really put some scale behind the ability to find patients and physicians that may have potential candidates. And then even from a physician perspective, historically, they used to have a lot of reservation because they would end up wanting to put their patient in that clinical trial, but there was this 50-50 shot that they may get a life-saving therapy, or they're going to go ahead and be in the control. One of the things that real-world evidence has completely changed, and the real-world data has completely changed, is now most of the patients are able to be enrolled in the test group and not the control group, because they're going to use the actual control group from real-world data and secondary data, and so they'll compare it against the standard of care. So that is incredibly meaningful to know, to doctors, to patients, that I can enroll in the clinical trial and I know I'm going to actually get the therapy, and the comparator is going to be, the data, instead of sacrificing a patient.
In that case, the source of that data, who's actually bringing it to the table? And in this specific scenario you're talking about, where the trial enrollment is working better, is this pharma using the data to increase the clinical trial enrollment? Is it like third parties that do that work?
So right now, the FDA in 2018 made the decree. This is why you saw the explosion, that they said you need to start using real world evidence when you come to us to prove, like, for your drug approval, and now even for medical devices. That happened in January of this year. They're saying that you need to go ahead and bring forth this data as part of, the validation of whether it's a need in the market, the validation that it's working. And so you will see a combination of it. So it's basically the FDA that is, requiring it, and then life sciences companies, and medtech and pharmaceutical companies will partner with labs and hospitals, the Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic. They'll go ahead and leverage those types of institutions to collect information, match it to even larger, sources of information from potentially like a healthcare clearinghouse or even a payer, and go ahead and present the real world evidence being a study.
So to piggyback off that, to your point, the pharma companies may engage in this on their own, but there are many organizations that specialize in clinical trial focus, right? So they'll partner with the life sciences organization to understand the goal of their study. They will then potentially have partnerships already in place with certain data providers and certain other organizations that may optimize that trial on behalf. So it's really, so Julie indicated the complexity of it. So there's really that two-pronged approach. Do you want to go it alone, or there are other organizations out there that can assist?
Like CROs.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So thank you for teeing up some shameless self-promotion for me. So one of my Health Cloud Capital companies, 3Aware, is actually the leader in real-world evidence for medical device, for medtech, and the leader in actually using advanced AI to give you the easy button to be able to say, these are my devices, how many are in the cohort, and getting down to the level of knowing exactly what device is in a given procedure for a patient by SKU, which is a whole different data set from the EHR. It's more supply chain linked in. So that's an example where you've got the opportunity to tokenize, the supply chain information that relates to patients' journeys and the EHR, data. And it's been phenomenally successful. All of the major medical device companies in the first year of commercialization for this tech have signed up and master subscription agreements. And it's because they're saying historically we had to do all these bespoke partnerships with health systems. We had to hire legions of consultants who then would spend 6 months and $500,000 and come back and say they can't even get the data we need. And so this totally flips that in the other direction. And part of the key that this modern AI world brings is true natural language understanding and insights that are contextually aware of what's in the physician's notes. And that's an area where I just, as I was thinking about the fourth grade point I was making earlier, because a lot of our viewers and listeners are not necessarily data experts, they're healthcare, leaders. That historically, when we talked about healthcare data like 10, 20 years ago, it was all claims. And so you had everybody and their brother, buying healthcare claims that don't necessarily give you the fidelity of what's actually going on with patients, other than just they had a test run or they had a procedure done, and there was nothing about the outcome really there, other than you could kind of try to figure it out. And it was delayed and slow. And from a de-identification perspective, the physician's notes are a huge freaking Pandora's box, right? And so I'm curious to know in what you're doing and seeing, what is the state of the art now, and how effective is it actually in ensuring that in those physician's notes, they didn't actually type in anything that was identifiable? It's tough.
It's not an easy process, but I will say that what's called LLM, so large language models, have been incredibly helpful in the detection of it. It's still an imperfect process and something that as someone who's doing the risk assessment and as an expert, for the identification, it's something that's immediately on the radar. And so even with a large language model, we'll analyze the fusion matrix of the false positives. How many times do we have the actual, PHI coming through, and what are the risks associated with it? And so it's not something we take lightly. And so you do tend to see it actually almost removed or redacted and modified because, putting the patient privacy is the most important component. But it's become a lot easier to parse the information so you can separate anything that says, okay, this could be, patient related versus what the clinical thought was, like a note to self by a provider. And so that's also been something that's been a key goal, is to really start to make those differentiations. And so that will, continue to build out with the increase in the models. And even from an open source perspective, there's a lot of libraries available online that's looking at different type of detection. And so that continues to enhance the capability.
And we know it's imperfect, and so let's just recognize that.
Yeah.
But as Julie indicated, as you said, it's imperfect, but to err on the side of caution. Right? If you think a clinical note might have PHI, that doesn't do it.
So what's the risk to the data partner that is participating in the identification if it turns out that one record slips by the goalie and has something that's identifiable in there? How big of a problem is that?
The goal is to make that very, very small, because ultimately we don't want to do anything but
I understand the goal. I'm saying when the goal, it's just true. I think it's just better just to put these things out in the world because people are thinking about them anyway. Like what happens when it?
I think we had a little bit of a taste of that. Now it was a little bit different. A couple of years ago, there was a major hack on a large clearinghouse that had a significant disruption on our entire industry. Right. And I would argue that
Is this the change?
Yes. And that really brought to light a lot of what Julie has talked about and brought it up to a much higher level. And the result of that is much better patient security and patient and tokenization standards. So I think, to answer your question, the result could be catastrophic, right? We live in a world where, to paraphrase an old IT leader, a hacker needs to be lucky once and everybody else has to be perfect all the time, right? And that's very difficult, but that's the mission that we take, right? So I think that had a very big impact. So to summarize, the implications can be significant.
So what I've seen is that there's the ability, this is all math, and there's like a statistical analysis that says like what is the risk that there might be some kind of PHI still in here. And it's really kind of an ambiguity issue where the machine says like I'm not really sure. And then if it's not really sure, it gets kicked out into a human review process. And then that human review process actually evaluates and determines whether or not there's PHI, and if so, it gets fixed, and then that reinforcement learning goes back into the model and makes it smarter and better. That's kind of the answer that I've seen.
Yeah, I would say that, the tokenization step is really removing the individual identifiers. So the goal is not to have, like, even after the tokenization, that doesn't have an error rate. There's not
But there are no physician's notes when you tokenize?
Oh, so tokenization is just for the direct PHI information. For the structured data, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But once you convey the information, there's the notes actually create a lot of value. So you're tokenizing so that hey, this is a patient that's not identifiable.
Okay.
And I get that. I mean, it's through the algorithm. But and I'm really not trying to be combative. I'm trying to be educational. Because this is, the world we live in too, right?
Oh,
So we want to drive the value, and we want to like get out of people's minds these like latent, unspoken concerns, right? And so once you get to the point where you've tokenized, and then you're saying, okay, we want to use this longitudinal patient information to drive some value, you're going to have other payload in there other than the stuff that you stripped out. You're going to have physician's notes, for example. Is that fair? Right?
Absolutely.
And then the ones who you can't, like the machine can't say with certainty that all the PHI is gone because there's some element in it where it's like, I don't know what the hell this is. It might be that the physician uses some kind of shorthand, annotated thing or some kind of abbreviation or something. And those just basically get excluded from what's going to get conveyed. Is that fair?
Yeah, and then there's also, I will say that it is a multi-check process. There's nothing that one time you're going to go ahead and let it run through. There's going to be an additional check. So for the notes, it'll go ahead and use a model. And then if there's anything that missed, there's going to be a manual review to make sure that they're not seeing anything. And so, that is, the whole, you can never be 100%. And to your point, yes, you can absolutely have direct PHI come through. But because you're reducing it by putting so many gatekeepers, components along the pathway to make sure that doesn't happen, the chances are very small.
Super helpful. Okay, so getting out of the tactics and into more of the strategy and the opportunity that exists and what the future looks like. So if you look forward at this, we had the earlier conversation with Dr. Matt Wilson and Elliot Josephson about what's going on with diagnostics and genomics and this explosion of new ways to study and draw these connections between what's going on with health today and what's going to be in the future, and embedding that into more of the just like standard way that care is delivered. So instead of having to have some research study over here that takes all kind of energy and extra cost, everybody's in effect part of a research study. What do you see looking out in the future, given what we now have at our disposal with AI, happening to this world of data and healthcare and how it's used to unlock insights that make healthcare better and faster? Is it going to accelerate at a pace that's in line with what's happening with AI?
Well, I think that, the life sciences has used this type of data for a very long time. The one thing I've seen the biggest adoption for recently has actually been providers. This has really been an incredibly insightful tool for them to learn about not just what they're seeing at their hospital, but to put into context the other factors of the market. And so when they go into the conversations, from a genetic perspective, or even from, the value-based care perspective that we talked about earlier today, you're negotiating between the payer and the provider. And there's other factors that are contributing that go ahead and change that dynamic that may not only be reflected in your own data. So having the ability to scale your data, even look outside like the own specific hospital data, they go and purchase data about the market. When they sit down with the payer, they can go ahead and have the dialogue to say, this market is short on primary care physicians. We know that we're going to have misses in preventative medicine, or, this market has a bias towards this type of genetic mutation. So, it starts to allow providers to really become empowered with information and data to have a conversation to the payers to figure out something that's much more negotiable and agreeable, because they know a lot more information and have a much better profile about the overall patient population that's showing up.
That's really interesting, John.
AI is a game changer. I think that's a pretty well known thing at this point, but leveraging tokenized data and bringing all these different data assets together in a safe, meaningful way for patients so that a caregiver, and I heard this in the previous podcast, there's a human component to that, right? That care provider is presented with information through AI. We could do that at speeds that have been unprecedented with data accuracy through tokenization that is unprecedented. We still need to feed these models with clean data. I asked AI what it thought clean data was, and it's standardized data sets coming at a reoccurring frequency thing. It's a standard data management program process. But it's also about trusted data that we feed these models with, right? And that's a very important thing. You don't want to pull data about an Alzheimer's test necessarily from the internet, right? You need to find a trusted source to feed that model so that you get the accurate results for that provider to interpret, for that provider to then communicate to the patient. So I'm very excited to see where this can go.
That's interesting. So in that model, we've got a built-in monitoring communication approach that is benefiting the caregivers themselves and the healthcare provider organizations in their ability to connect with and collaborate with the payers. So it's interesting how that converges a bit with the whole conversation about value-based care, right?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, it's going to be really important. I've been to a couple of summits, and they're all been provider based, and the hospitals are frustrated because they're trying to understand what they can do to convey the things that they're dealing with. And so, I encourage them all the time to go ahead and leverage, different types of data that are out there, pull it together and truly put context to your market. And it's not even just healthcare data. You can use different types of data to understand, the demographics about, the market, understand income. That's incredibly important to kind of tie those things together and to say, look, we have a shortage. We have a bias on the elderly population comparatively because, ultimately they're comparing hospital by hospitals and looking at outcomes. If you are, basically handicapped because you have a population that is, in worse health than in, another hospital, because you're getting all the poor cases of the patients that have a more severe disease burden, you want to know that. And you want to go ahead and have an honest conversation. So I think, this type of data brings a level of honesty and context that is helpful for providers in a big, big way.
Super helpful. Well, thank you for these thoughts. I'd love to hear if there are any questions from our audience.
Hey guys, thank you. Labs are sitting on a ton of data, and when you talk to lab owners or people in the lab about their data strategy, they're like terrified. They don't know what to do. They don't know what it means. They have tried and attempted, but things didn't work out. So what's the opportunity now, maybe with more AI capabilities or more, tokenization, maybe even blockchain introduces something that helps further. But what's the opportunity for labs to really monetize the data for the benefit of the lab, but also for bigger picture for the benefit of research and all that?
I mean, frankly, I think it enables lab data to be used in ways that it never was before, right? So lab data, as you put before, provides proactive clinical intelligence, right? Whereas traditional data sources like claims and RX, which, a lot of large organizations have been using for a long time, tells you what happened, right? So advancements in tokenization, advancements in standardization, advancements in AI will enable lab organizations to have their data more standardized, more clean, et cetera, and be used in these types of engagements that benefit the patient population. So
I guess we need to figure out a way to convince the lab owners, let's say, that it's, there's a real possibility to do it without taking any risks and all that. That's the barrier. Like I've been involved in projects that try to do that, specifically on rare disease genomic data, and it doesn't work. It's like everybody's terrified and you can't move it. Like,
right.
I don't know. So maybe people like you that understand it better can communicate it better.
I've done a tremendous amount of work in rare disease and oncology, and so we were able to get some of those very specialty labs on board. And so the other big thing too with labs is you guys have some of the most predictive power possible because you start to see in your test results when people are starting to go awry in their journey, right? And so you're able to go ahead and do pattern detection to say, okay, this person's headed on a very poor track. We can see this already just from their A1C results, or different types of tests that I have available. So the diagnostic data and the lab data in particular is incredibly valuable. And I think that what's big change in the market the most has been an appreciation for what it can do. And I think, once people start to see what the capabilities are, they're going to go ahead and want to get involved.
And pharma are willing to pay. I'm looking at Lilly right in front of me. They're looking to pay good amounts of money for the data.
Yeah, and the comment on that, so this question about diagnostic labs, and I think Robert has a question also, Marcus, but so I mentioned this earlier. I think there is a bit of a disconnect between the reality of the value from a given lab's data and what the lab might perceive. And there are very few labs that have the scale to where just doing pharma deals based on information that can be gleaned from their data is going to move the needle for them at all relative to their overall business. And I think that is actually a big issue that needs to be discussed and understood. But I think, to me, for the diagnostic lab, the typical diagnostic lab, it's not the hyperscale like LabCorp or Quest, the opportunities to be part of those coalitions that are bringing together valuable information and then measuring that value and that impact such that they can get paid more for their core business. And some very innovative labs have been successful at partnering very directly with biotech companies and doing specific kinds of programs and research. Now, the tricky bit there is that has to be completely separated from their ongoing operation for testing that they're getting reimbursed for. So you can't have a biotech pay for your digital pathology, for example, and then use that same stuff to do the testing you're doing for conventional tests and diagnostics. But it's a very important point. Robert?
Well, for Julie, you were talking about lab data as predictive. And I'm curious if you've had any clients, say health system clients, that have used lab data in a predictive way, de-identified, or maybe a regional payer has said, deliver me this database, say from Indiana Health, and de-identify it, and let me see where the trends are. And that would allow the payer to then begin to say, I'll incentivize the health system to take these disease states on as a priority.
I mean, you're seeing the hospital systems, they're kind of new to the race, if you will. So they're starting to learn. So I've been out there. So it's not just me, there's other people out there too, trying to encourage them to realize the power of data. Because again, they have always looked through it through only their lens. And I think those horse blinders really have been true horse blinders because they really need a lot more context, for the market. And so there are very specific regional, behaviors, the West Virginia and Virginia coal mining areas, they have very different implications. You go ahead and see them compared to the national population, you're going, no, this is not how this works. There's very specific disease burdens and diseases that exist, from a geographic perspective that need to be taken into account. And so I do think you will see more predictive elements. And I think that you'll start to see someone, be getting alert that they're not progressing in a good way. They're progressing in a bad way. In addition, at the patient level and even to a system level to say, hey, there needs to be an intervention, happening here.
Yeah, maybe just one more quick question to kind of tether the data sets to what Eliane mentioned before, the consumer and wearable piece of it. When you think about Apple Health Kit or Garmin, all of our personal data. I mean, let's just use, for example, the COVID case. If you were to actually go back and look in time and say, okay, if you were to track all the folks that had an Apple Watch or a Garmin traveling from, Asia over to the U.S. during a period of time, you could probably see certain patterns that would predict, okay, there is going to be something happening, right? How do you guys think about the integration of all of our personal data sets in order to enable, effective use of the data relative to the personal, aspect of it?
I mean, that should get everybody in the room excited, right? I mean, that's the goal. That's where we're moving towards. And applications like Julie's and the tokenization enables that. AI and those technologies enable the fast action upon that data. I mean, this is where we are going, right? And getting on board with these types of softwares and tokenizations and applications is paramount for any organization, right? To truly understand your patient population, you can no longer look at claims data. You can no longer look at RX data. You should look at those, right? But where we're going is all these introductions of new data assets that are just as powerful, right? And who knows, there's going to be a new wearable tomorrow, right? That we'll all adopt, and we'll have to figure that out as well.
I mean, just personally, I'm very biased. This is a little story, but my husband literally has life saved because of an Apple Watch, and I bought it for him, and he was cursing at me the whole way that I went ahead and bought him this Apple Watch and didn't want the wearable, and it kept triggering one thing for atrial fib, and we go to the emergency room, and we walk in, and they hook him up to the monitor, and they're like, "No, we think he's okay," and the watch keeps going off, and so he's going ahead, just death glaring at me, and so this nurse comes in and says, "No, let me just switch the monitor." And they go ahead and switch the monitor and hook them up to a different one. And next thing I know, that like monitor is going off from an alarm bell perspective, and I'm getting escorted out of the room, and they're taking my husband away as they're pushing him back on the table. And he's someone who is on top of his, going to the doctor. He goes to a cardiologist. There was a huge miss, right? And so I would love to know what sort of signs that we saw in his health and data that caused this to happen, where there was almost a mistake at the hospital, because if she didn't hook him up to the other one, we would have gone home and he would have been in atrial fib and had a stroke. So I think there's a lot of power. And as these things come together, we just have to do it responsibly, and that's the goal.
Time for one more question. Right in front of you, Marcus.
So the Cures Act unlocked EHR data due to the information blocking rules, but there's a bifurcation between those EHRs that choose to be certified and those that are not. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are as to what needs to be done to enable access to all patient data across the entire spectrum.
Well, I could give a shot at that. So the question around enabling access to all patient data across the spectrum, I think the reality is there's probably not a near-term answer to that, the 100% coverage. But I think there is a lot of promise around just the fact that that act exists and this whole concept exists around using the information in a posture that is going to advance the cause of healthcare versus only focusing on the protective. HIPAA means prevention of access to data. And I don't really understand why you wouldn't want to be certified as an EHR. I do know also there's this recent lawsuit Epic filed related to the exchange of data under one of the federal programs, where they felt that there was an actor who was leveraging that program in a way that wasn't consistent with the program. So there's still a lot of figuring out to do. But the fact that we have governmental programs at all that address the concept of making the data available feels like progress to me.
I totally echo that. I mean, we had made progress. When I started my healthcare journey 20 years ago, I mean, we downloaded an NPI file and it had NPS, right? So we have made more progress in making data accessible. And I think as forums like this continue to discuss the topic, we continue to push the boundaries, the data will only become more accessible because we can show the value, right? And I think we've made great steps. I mean, CMS continues to make more data publicly available, which is fantastic. But we made progress. We will continue to make progress, and it's up to the folks in this room and listening to push those boundaries so that more progress and adoption can be made.
One more comment on this as I'm thinking about it. I think there's also that segment of the population that is getting into biometrics and wearables and monitoring and starting to connect diagnostics with that. And I think you'll end up with increasingly a connection between those sorts of technologies and that kind of information in this world of research and innovation and how we can actually get ahead of things. And I love this idea of making it more of a standard within healthcare to build in the concept of upfront, are you open? It's sort of like the organ donor thing on your license. Like there's a standard way where you say, are you willing to be an organ donor? And many people say yes. I'm dead anyway. I might as well use my organs for something. I think it's the same kind of thing here, where if we get into a standard where it's upfront saying, hey, are you willing to have your information be part of these programs to advance healthcare, it seems like that'd be a pretty big power up if that became universal, right? And then it's a whole different lever from the one where it's a federal program related to what the EHRs certify or not.
I was just going to say, I think there's going to be an increase in even just patient pressure, to be honest with you, that will be a catalyst. I think there was a pretty shocking moment that happened about a year ago where Elon Musk on Twitter said, can you guys send me your images and scans and your personal medical data? And he had millions of people go ahead and send it right online, right? And so I think people want answers and they have a lot of questions about their health. And so I think that that type of patient pressure is going to go ahead and operate as a catalyst to really get these companies to exchange data more freely for the benefit of a patient.
So I know you're out of time, but I really just got to add this if I could. We can't lose the thread a little bit. I think there's a distrust inherently built in. Sorry. And I think one of the problems is that
it's recorded, so if you're not.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I think there's an inherent distrust built into this whole premise and this whole discussion in that people want to own their data. And that's left out of the equation all the time. And I'm in leadership in a health system, so I understand the advancing the public health. I understand all those arguments and the value in doing so. But there's going to be a point where people aren't just going to want to give their data because I don't mean to be a libertarian in the room, but there is an element of that where it's time people take back, the power of their data and own it just like they own their car or their house. And once that happens, I think then those guardrails will be in place and that the whole new infrastructure of trust will be established where then maybe people will be like, gladly give away their data if they can monetize it themselves, for example.
Right, and even if they can't monetize it via cash, if they can see the value that they're contributing to via these kinds of breakthroughs, it's almost like the reputation rewards in social network systems where the more likes or the more followers or whatever, like to the extent you had that kind of incentive, so it was a bit altruistic, but also personal in terms of getting recognition for what you're contributing. That's an interesting angle on it. I'm with you. And I think also this world of consumer-driven care gets probably more to what you're describing. So, well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me here. Julie Ferris of Spindle Health and John Markl of HC1 and everybody here for the Healthcare Innovation Summit in Indianapolis brought to you by HC1. That's a wrap for now. Thanks for being here for another episode of Boombostic Health. I'm your host, Bradley Bostic. We'll see you next time.